Hi everyone, my name is Kylie James. I'm a certified nutritionist here at Crow Nutrition, and I'm here today to talk about autism and nutrition. It is Autism Awareness Month, and autism has been something that I've wanted to get into for a very long time. Um, I just find nutrition, I'm passionate about nutrition and brain chemistry. And I feel like with kids and the autism, it is so pronounced the impact, the profound impact that nutrition can have on autistic symptoms. So I thought today would be a great opportunity to share with you some insights into this, and we'll get going. Now, one of the really interesting things about autism is there is a number of different underlying reasons why kids have autistic symptoms and are diagnosed with autism. And it's really important to acknowledge those and identify the different factors that may contribute to that, because that will determine the type of treatment and intervention that they need. So, for example, one huge factor with kids with autism is the immune function, and it's just having difficulty working properly. So, a big thing is gut inflammation, which is why so many kids have digestive issues and nutrient absorption problems. But gut inflammation is huge, and the ability to fight invading pathogens, so viruses, bacteria, yeast, and candida, which is huge with kids on the spectrum. And of course, food sensitivities and food allergies, which create those antibodies as a result. So, immune function can be compromised with kids on the spectrum. Another big factor is the ability to detoxify. So, kids on the spectrum are very sensitive to pollutants, um, environmental pollutants, and also the various toxins in our foods, such as food additives, artificial colorings, flavorings, pesticides, herbicides, and things like that. So one thing is really focusing on going organic with kids on the spectrum, so they don't have those added toxins in their body, and they just have that decreased ability to detoxify what, say, you and myself are able to do. Kids on the spectrum have a lot more difficulty doing. Another big impact is digestion. So, a lot of you may have heard of leaky gut, which is intestinal permeability. So, as we eat food, our body breaks it down into its smallest component, and we have these little junctions in our intestines where those food particles that are broken down to its smallest component um, go into the bloodstream and go on to do wonderful things in the body and the brain. But if we have leaky gut and those tight junctions become larger, then undigested food particles, pathogens, toxins, they also leak into our body. Our body doesn't recognize these and creates an immune response. This also can contribute to things like another function with digestion that can become compromised is gut dysbiosis, when we have an overflow of bad bacteria proliferating, or yeast, and not enough of that good bacteria to fight that off. And because of this leaky gut, because of our gut inflammation and food sensitivities, etc., the child may have difficulty with absorbing those nutrients and assimilating them into the body so they can do the functions that they need to do. Another interesting aspect with kids with autism is that at a mitochondria cellular level, so the actual cells in their body just aren't functioning properly. And there's chemical pathways called methylation and sulfation, which helps with detoxification, which helps to make neurotransmitters for our brain. They may not be working properly, which is why kids present with autistic behaviors. Other cellular function problems can be poor muscle tone, so they just tend to have like a muscle weakness, they're not strong, or poor gut motility, which is the body's ability to move that food down the esophagus, through the intestines, and out the other end. So that sluggish gut motility causes things like constipation, reabsorbs toxins in the body that the body's trying to get rid of, and things like that. So all of these impact brain chemistry and neurological function. So you can get brain inflammation, you can get an opiate-like response in the brain, which we're going to talk about that today. those toxins in your gut, those bacteria in your gut can release toxins that can travel up and affect brain chemistry. And of course, like it impacts with neurotransmitters because you don't have the nutrients to make them, you don't have the chemical pathways to make them properly. And of course, with nutrient deficiencies and oxidative stress, it's all going to impact brain chemistry. So as you can see, there's a lot of underlying factors that may contribute to autism, and your child may have some of these, may not have others, may have a combination, may just have one, but it's really important to find what that underlying reason is so you can implement the right intervention. So if we just backtrack and look at kids' diets today, it's a typical standard American diet, which is abbreviated for SAD. It's a lot of highly processed foods, a lot of refined grains, and a lot of sugar in so many different forms. When you pick up a packet of cookies, you'll find it doesn't just have sugar, but it has sucralose and dextrose and maltodextrin and high fructose corn syrup, which is really bad. So this plays huge problems with brain chemistry. All those additives, artificial flavorings and colorings and preservatives, those processed meats like hot dogs, which is really popular with kids, and deli meats, they all contain substances and compounds that can be really negatively impact neurological function and brain function. Processed foods like cheese whiz, which isn't really even a food. But a really big problem in this day and age is the amount of sugar that we get from beverages, from juice, from pop, energy drinks, sports drinks. That is a huge contributing factor to the amount of sugar that we and our children get in their diets. And just poor healthy options with eating out. Right now, we're in another lockdown. I can't even remember how many lockdowns we've had. But, with parents working and homeschooling, often we're ordering in takeout, or if we're on the road, picking up McDonald's. And there's not many healthy options out there. And a lot of people just gravitating to those typical foods that are really highly processed and have poor nutritional value. So with kids with autism, they need to be eating a really nutritious and healthy, balanced diet. But specific to kids, well, all kids need to be eating that, right? But specific to kids with autism, because of those underlying factors that I was talking about earlier, they may need to be on a special diet. And there's so many special diets out there for kids with autism. Again, it's very much dependent on what foods they're craving, what their symptoms are, and what the underlying pathological reason is for why they're having those symptoms. So a lot of diets are digestive-based diets to support the digestion. So that's the specific carbohydrate diet, the GAPS diet, the FODMAPs diet, the body ecology diet. Gluten and casein is like a food. A lot of foods, gluten and casein are really inflammatory to the body and can interfere and cause that leaky gut and gut inflammation. But then there's also issues with processing certain compounds in foods that are even healthy. So salicylates, phenols, oxalate, thiosulfate, fingold, those are all diets that have specific compounds in them. Foods have specific compounds in them that can be harmful to the child, but they're actually healthy foods. Low glutamate amine diet is another one. So usually kids that are very defiant, aggressive behavior tend to do well on a low glutamate amine diet. Other diets out there for kids with autism, the ketogenic diet, the paleo diet, the low carb diet, the candida diet, and diets to support those chemical pathways that I mentioned before, methylation and sulfation, which is really important for detoxification and for making neurotransmitters for our brain. So what are the goals of this special diet? They're really to remove burden from the body. These certain foods and compounds in foods are really creating havoc in a child's body and affecting brain chemistry. So by eliminating those or significantly reducing them, it really takes that burden off the body. It helps to reduce inflammation, and usually with this, you're adding a lot of nourishing, rich foods to help address those nutrient deficiencies and get those nutrients in to help with those chemical pathways and brain chemistry. So it's fueling the brain and the cells, and like I mentioned before, it supports those chemical pathways that are not working properly. It really helps to work on underlying factors to improve body functions and tolerance where possible. Now, the goal with the diet, because it can be restrictive, especially if kids have a combination of issues, they might need to be on a low oxalate and a low salicylate diet. So it might really limit their food choices. Then they're a picky eater, and plus they're a child, right? So they want child appropriate foods. The real goal for the diet is making sure that it's as least restrictive as possible and as varied as possible given the restrictions. So this is the tricky thing, and why it's so important, I feel, for parents out there to get support by a clinician that has experience working with autism, because I do see it time and time again that parents it's so stressful when the kids aren't eating much and have very restrictive diets, and then the foods that you're asking them to take away are the pretty much the only foods that they're actually consuming. But the importance of following these special diets is that they can have a profound impact on your child's symptoms and autistic behaviors. So there was a study done where parents were rated their child's improvements with being on a special diet. And the improvements that they noted included gastrointestinal problems relieved, diarrhea and constipation either lessened or resolved. There was improved language skills and learning, greater focus and attention, reduced hyperactivity, improved eye contact, and more appropriate behavior. And see, a lot of these behaviors we would not necessarily attribute to diet and food, but there's a really strong correlation there. Aggressive behavior and tantrums may improve, better sleeping, easier toilet training, and a lot of those skin issues, so rashes, eczema, rosacea, tend to clear up. And the parents reported their kids just tended to be better in terms of health and happiness. So again, so many improvements by following a special diet. But again, it's important to identify which special diet does your child need to be following. So a good starting place is to go gluten and casein free. This is a good starting place for all kids on the spectrum, especially if you are not in a position to go and see a clinician or afford to see a clinician on this. This is a really good starting point. Ideally, you probably want to go gluten, casein, and soy free, because soy has a very excitatory amino acid in it called glutamate, which can contribute to that hyperactivity, those aggressive behaviors as well. But just for today, the first thing is wanting to go gluten and casein free. And the reason being, there was studies showing that over 3,593 kids were put on a gluten and casein-free diet, and the parents reported out of that number, 69% of children with autism experienced symptom improvements. If they only went gluten-free or casein-free, they didn't go both, there was a 55% improvement. So it definitely shows that doing both together, you're going to get more benefits from it. But I know sometimes it can be tricky based on what your child's eating habits are and the situation. So maybe you do want to focus on one or the other. Now, there's so many reasons why we want to go gluten and casein free with kids with autism. So first of all, there can be food intolerances where your body's creating antibodies to combat gluten and casein. There's food allergy reactions. There's a DPPIV enzyme that is used to break down gluten, or there could be different digestive enzymes that are not working properly, or your child doesn't have enough of, that's impacting their ability to break down the protein, gluten, and casein. There's that opioid activity that I reported. So when children tend to gravitate towards like lots of bread, lots of crackers, lots of cheese, lots of milk, it may be because it's creating this opioid-like response in the brain, which is a high, which is a bit of a morphine rush, and so then they tend to gravitate to those foods more and more, as a result, avoiding other food groups altogether, creating this sort of picky eating that we see so often with kids on the spectrum. Gluten and casein contain harmful lectins. There's issues with folate receptor antibodies, and of course, they contribute to inflammation. So, just in the general population, I work a lot with the anti-inflammatory diet, which has really helped to show improvements with pain, sleep, depression, weight loss. And the big thing with that diet is getting rid of the gluten and the casein, because it can be, for a lot of people, very inflammatory. So by getting rid of gluten and casein, you're allowing the healing of the gut. You're allowing for nutrients to be absorbed into the body and assimilated. And this allows for systemic improvement. So I wanted to talk a bit about food allergies, food sensitivities, and food intolerances, because a lot of time these names have been used interchangeably, but they are quite different. So food allergies are your IgEs, and these create like an immediate reaction and can be quite acute. So for example, if your child consumes peanuts and then their throat swells up, or they consume strawberries and they break out in hives straight away, that's a food allergy, and that's an IgE antibody that's been created. Then there's food sensitivities, and these are your IgGs, IgM, and IgA antibodies. And these are delayed reactions. And what's interesting, you could eat a food, or your child could eat a food on the Monday, but you may not see that reaction to that food for 1 to 3 days later, so maybe on the Wednesday. So it'd be very hard sometimes to make that correlation that that food caused that headache on the Wednesday. The problem is if our kids are consuming those foods every day, it's even harder to make that correlation. So food sensitivities can be a number of symptoms such as digestive disturbance, pain, inflammation, hyperactivity, and anxiety. It can be, the big ones tend to be gluten and casein, as well as soy, but eggs, peanuts, and corn as well. So, but basically it can be any food. And now food intolerances is something different altogether. It's not an antibody reaction. It's not where the immune system's involved, but it's another way that our body responds negatively to food. So it could be the child's ability to break down certain carbohydrates that are called FODMAPs, or breaking down glutamates, amines, salicylates, lectins, those sort of food compounds that actually create a negative reaction in the body. So I wanted to talk about those opioid peptides, because like picky eaters is such a huge problem with kids on the spectrum. And I wanted to talk about sort of in some ways that high that kids get when they consume foods that they are addicted to. And as a clinician, that's one of my sort of telling signs. It's like, what does your kid crave? Because that's probably the problematic food. So of course it causes a food addiction. So they might have temper tantrums if they can't get that food. And they actually, interestingly enough, have a high pain tolerance. And that's likely because of that morphine effect, that opioid-like response in the brain. They can have inattention, spacey behavior, aggression to self and others. They can have those stimming movements, those repetitive movements, mood changes, poor eye contact, difficulty speaking, and anxiety, depression, and irritability. So something to be mindful and to looking at with your child. The big problem with gluten is it can really cause inflammation and damage to the intestines, which contributes to what I was talking before about that leaky gut, those tight junctions in our intestines that now become more permeable and allow for those invading pathogens, undigested food particles to get into the bloodstream and create this immune response. It can cause enzymes to be diminished, and it affects the body's ability to absorb nutrients and amino acids, therefore causing nutrient deficiencies, which in turn impact on our child's mood, behavior, and cognition. Because it creates that inflammation, it really puts a lot of strain on the child's immune system. And again, it impacts the child's eating habits. So gluten can be huge in terms of inflammation, contributing to depression, anxiety, and ADHD-like behaviors. So how do you identify a food allergy or a food sensitivity? Well, obviously with the acute ones, it's easy. They eat the food, they have a hive reaction, their throat closed up. That's easy to make that correlation. If they're craving certain foods, that's another sign, because it's like they're getting that high from that food, so they're really gravitating to that food. Now, you can do food allergy testing, but it's not it's not a foolproof way to identify food allergies. So, for example, if your child is following a gluten casein free diet and you decide to do the food allergy testing to see if they have a problem with it, it's not going to show up, because if the child's not consuming the foods, then your body's not making the antibiotics to compound that food. So it's not going to show up in the food allergy testing. So they need to be consuming that food to identify the antibodies, but it's not necessarily foolproof, and it's not going to show up those food intolerances. So really the goal, but it does give you some guidelines, and it is a quick way to identify what foods may be triggers or contributing to symptoms that your child are experiencing. The gold standard, though, is the elimination diet. So basically, you eliminate those foods from the diet and then introduce them slowly back in and monitor symptoms. So that's really where a dietitian and nutritionist can come in and sort of help with that kind of diet. If you are going to do the food elimination diet, you really need 100% compliance, because a small amount can create a reaction. If you're going casein free, you're going to notice improvements within the first 1 to 3 weeks. If you're going gluten free, you're not going to see results until 1 to 3 months. So really you want to be on this diet for 3 months, gluten and casein free, to really see the benefits from that. So you can do both, or you can start with one. But like I mentioned before, there is more improvement, 69% more improvement when you go gluten and casein free, as opposed to 55% if you just do one of those food groups. I really recommend that you introduce new foods and food alternatives before taking out those foods. A lot of our kids are just really, their diets are heavy in breads and crackers and cheese and cow's milk and things like that. So to take some of that stress out, I think it's good to start incorporating those foods in, so it's not so overwhelming and stressful for everyone. And it's important to also recognize that symptoms may get worse before they get better, and that's because of that withdrawal from that opioid-like response from the brain. So interesting things to take into consideration, but it is a really good starting point and gives you some ideas of what you can anticipate. So that's the end of that presentation. If anyone has any questions, please reach out to me at Kylie@crownutrition.com. And in a couple of weeks, I'll be interviewing a naturopath doctor that specializes with kids on the spectrum and sort of her role with that. So it's really interesting in terms of the lab tests that they do. But thanks everyone for listening, and I will see you soon. Bye.